Are you losing muscle mass right now without even realizing it? If you're like most people, especially men and women over the age of 25, you might already be in a slow but dangerous decline. Not because you stopped exercising, not because of your diet, but because of one habit. A single, daily behavior that seems harmless on the surface, but is quietly switching off your body's ability to build and preserve muscle. It's not just stealing your strength, it's stealing your health, your energy, your hormones, your sleep, and eventually your independence. If that sounds dramatic, it's not. It's biological, and if you want to not only build muscle but retain it, if you want your brain and body working in alignment for performance, longevity, and even mental sharpness, you need to understand this. What I'm about to tell you isn't theory, it's neuroscience. And once you hear how it works, you'll never look at your daily routine the same way again. So what is the habit? It's chronic, passive sitting. That's right. Hours upon hours of remaining sedentary, especially in slouched, chair-bound positions, is slowly but consistently shutting off your muscle-building mechanisms, not just by reducing physical movement, but by disrupting neural signaling between your brain and your muscles. Here's what's happening under the surface. Your muscles are not independent actors. They're fully integrated with your central and peripheral nervous system. Every contraction, every lift, every stabilizing twitch is regulated through motor neurons that originate in your spinal cord and are modulated by your brain. These neurons form what's called neuromuscular junctions, the communication hubs between your nervous system and your muscle tissue. When you move with intention, walking, lifting, standing, even fidgeting, those neurons remain engaged. But the moment you sit for extended periods without muscular engagement, your body receives a different message. Muscle isn't necessary right now, and your body listens. The first thing to change is motor unit recruitment, which drops significantly in static positions. Without movement, your motor neurons stop firing. Over time, this causes the atrophy of type 2E fast twitch muscle fibers, the very fibers responsible for strength, speed, and explosive power. And if you're sedentary for most of the day, even if you hit the gym for an hour, this degradation still happens. In fact, a single hour of intense training is not enough to offset 8-10 hours of neural inactivity. Now, layer onto that a cascade of hormonal responses. Extended sitting, especially when combined with poor posture and screen exposure, increases cortisol, the stress hormone. Chronically elevated cortisol is catabolic, meaning it breaks down tissue, including muscle. At the same time, testosterone, growth hormone, and IGF-1, which are essential for protein synthesis and muscular repair, begin to drop. Your body shifts from an anabolic growth state to a catabolic breakdown state. And the consequences show up slowly but consistently. Still think sitting is harmless. There's also the issue of glucose metabolism. When you're seated for long periods, especially post-meal, your insulin sensitivity drops. This causes blood sugar spikes and fat storage, particularly around the abdomen. More visceral fat leads to more inflammation, which further impairs hormone balance and muscle protein synthesis. And then there's sleep. Poor muscular engagement throughout the day reduces adenosine accumulation, a key neuromodulator that helps you feel tired at night. Less adenosine means lower sleep pressure. Add in excess blue light and stress from prolonged digital exposure, and your melatonin release gets disrupted. Now your sleep suffers, and your nighttime recovery, when most muscle repair occurs, becomes compromised. That means less deep sleep, reduced human growth hormone release, and ultimately weaker muscle regeneration. So this single habit, extended passive sitting, is not just about posture. It's about a full body chain reaction, a brain disengagement, neural atrophy, muscle loss, hormonal imbalance, impaired sleep, reduced recovery and energy the next day. But here's the good news, it's reversible. And you don't need to overhaul your life to fix it. You just need to introduce strategic, science-based habits that re-engage your nervous system and retrain your body to operate in an anabolic state throughout the day. The first fix, break your sedentary time every 30 minutes. Even 2 minutes of light movement, Walking bodyweight squats, isometric holds can reactivate motor neuron circuits. This keeps the neuromuscular system alert and responsive. Second, use visual and vestibular resets. Change your focus from near to far every hour. Gaze out a window. Stand and move your eyes horizontally without moving your head. These techniques resync your brainstem's orientation system, which modulates posture, tension, and alertness. Third, expose yourself to natural light in the morning and avoid bright artificial light 90 minutes before bed. This simple circadian reset boosts cortisol early when it's helpful and enhances melatonin later when you need to recover and grow. Fourth, train smart. Don't just lift heavy. Engage in explosive, compound movements that recruit multiple muscle groups and increase motor unit recruitment. These tell your brain one needs strength to survive, and your biology responds. Finally, fix your posture when sitting. Sit upright, hips higher than knees, spine neutral, feet grounded. Better posture supports better neural feedback to your brain and improves respiration, circulation, and even cognition. In short, you're not weak. You're not broken. You're just wired into a modern habit that contradicts how your nervous system evolved. But once you understand the connection between behavior and biology, you can rewire it fast. So the next time you catch yourself sitting passively for 3, 4, or 5 hours, remember it's not just time passing. It's strength leaking. It's health being traded for convenience. But now you know the truth. And with that truth comes the power to change not just your body, but your biology. Fix this habit before it's too late. When we think of muscle loss, most people immediately associate it with aging, poor nutrition, or a lack of resistance training. But what if I told you that the primary driver behind the loss of muscle mass for millions of people is a seemingly harmless daily habit that nearly every adult engages in for hours at a time without thinking twice? This habit doesn't involve bad food or skipping workouts. It's sitting, specifically chronic passive sitting. And it's not just a postural issue. It's a neurological and metabolic cascade that begins to shrink your muscle fibers at the microscopic level. Muscles are highly dynamic tissues. They respond moment to neural input, hormonal shifts, mechanical tension, and inflammation. At the core of all muscle function lies a critical mechanism, motor neuron activation. These neurons are like command cables, sending precise electrical signals from your spinal cord to each individual muscle fiber, instructing it when to contract, how powerfully, and for how long. When these neurons stop firing, whether from disuse or long periods of physical inactivity, your body receives a biological message that says, this muscle is not needed. In response, your body, in an effort to conserve energy, begins to downregulate anabolic processes like protein synthesis and instead activates pathways that lead to atrophy or tissue degradation. Research from both sports science and neurobiology confirms that even just several hours of uninterrupted sitting significantly decreases lower limb blood flow, reduces nerve conductivity, and shuts down glute and core motor unit recruitment. This is not something that happens after years. It begins within hours. Sitting in a static position reduces the mechanical tension needed to maintain muscle density. And without mechanical tension, especially on the larger muscles of the legs, hips, and back, the muscle fibers lose the critical stimuli required to remain metabolically active. What's even more concerning is that this muscle loss isn't just cosmetic or strength related. Muscle tissue plays a crucial role in glucose regulation, mitochondrial health, and immune modulation. When it begins to shrink, your insulin sensitivity drops, your mitochondrial output falls, and systemic inflammation increases. Essentially, your muscles stop behaving like efficient energy furnaces and start acting like dormant tissue, sapping vitality rather than generating it. The problem is further compounded by a decline in neuromuscular efficiency. Your brain literally forgets how to activate muscle groups it no longer uses. Neural maps begin to degrade. This means even when you do return to movement or exercise, the connection between your central nervous system and your muscular system is less precise, less coordinated, and less effective. That's why many people feel rusty or weak when getting back into training after long workdays or periods of inactivity. It's not just the muscle, it's the nervous system's loss of connection with that muscle. Add in the hormonal component, specifically the rise in cortisol and decline in anabolic hormones like testosterone and IGF-1, and the internal environment becomes hostile to muscle retention. Cortisol promotes protein breakdown and suppresses muscle regeneration. If sitting is paired with stress, poor sleep, and limited movement, the effects are magnified. What appears to be a simple rest period or desk job reality is actually a perfect storm for accelerated sarcopenia, especially in adults over 30. This means that unless deliberate action is taken to interrupt and reverse the pattern, the muscle you've worked hard to build or hope to preserve is being slowly dismantled by this one overlooked habit. The human body is constantly communicating with itself through a series of biochemical signals. These signals determine whether we're in a state of growth, repair, or breakdown. When it comes to muscle development and retention, the primary system at play is known as the anabolic signaling pathway. This includes a network of hormones, enzymes, and molecular receptors such as mTOR's mammalian target of rapamycin, IGF-1C insulin like growth factor 1, and growth hormone, all of which must be consistently activated in order for muscles to grow, recover, or even just maintain their size. The problem is that this system is incredibly sensitive to our behaviors, especially our levels of movement and engagement with our environment. One behavior, in particular, acts like a circuit breaker that shuts this entire anabolic process down: prolonged physical inactivity. Whether it's sitting at a desk for hours, lounging on a couch, or simply going through your day without engaging your muscles meaningfully, this inactivity sends a silent but powerful message to your body that growth is not necessary, that strength is not needed. And as a result, the body doesn't just pause muscle building, it actively suppresses it. The mTOR pathway, which is the central driver of muscle protein synthesis, is stimulated not only by resistance training and amino acid intake, but also by mechanical stress and intracellular tension. When the body is stationary for long durations, mechanical tension within muscle fibers decreases to near zero. The cellular machinery responsible for detecting load, mechanosensors embedded in the muscle membrane, essentially go dormant. This leads to a decline in mTOR activation and in turn lowers protein synthesis. What's more, the body begins to prioritize energy conservation over growth. This happens through the upregulation of AMPK, an enzyme that becomes dominant during low energy states and suppresses mTOR as a survival mechanism. In plain terms, your body starts behaving as though it's in a fasting or stress state, even if you've eaten enough, simply because you haven't moved enough. At the hormonal level, inactivity interferes with the secretion of IGF-1, which plays a major role in satellite cell proliferation and muscular repair. IGF-1 is highly responsive to mechanical load, especially compound movements that stress multiple joints and muscles. Without this kind of stimulus, levels of IGF-1 begin to drop, reducing the muscle's capacity to regenerate or grow. In fact, studies have shown that after just 72 hours of muscle disuse, the transcription of IGF-1 genes in muscle tissue begins to decline measurably. This means your body is literally reducing the blueprint for muscle growth simply because the message it's receiving is that muscle is no longer a priority. Complicating this even further is the role of cortisol. When we're sedentary for long stretches, particularly under mentally stressful conditions like multitasking on screens, traffic commutes, or tight work deadlines, cortisol is elevated. Cortisol acts as a catabolic hormone. It breaks down tissue to make energy more readily available. It does this by degrading muscle proteins into amino acids for gluconeogenesis, the process of generating glucose in the absence of food. While this process is necessary in acute stress scenarios, chronic elevation of cortisol can have a devastating effect on muscle retention. It blocks the uptake of amino acids into muscle cells, reduces testosterone and growth hormone output, and further inhibits mTOR. What results is a perfect physiological contradiction. Your body is breaking down muscle while simultaneously turning off the systems needed to rebuild it. This entire cascade is driven not by a lack of willpower or insufficient gym sessions, but by a miscommunication between behavior and biology. When the body doesn't move, it assumes that strength is no longer an evolutionary advantage, and the anabolic machinery powers down accordingly. Muscle growth is not just a mechanical response to lifting heavy weights or consuming protein. It is a neurochemical event that starts in the brain. Your ability to build and preserve lean muscle tissue depends heavily on the way your nervous system interacts with your endocrine system and how that interaction is shaped by your daily behaviors. Most people believe that muscle gain begins and ends in the gym, but in truth, it begins in your central nervous system, particularly within the motor cortex, hypothalamus, and brainstem. These regions regulate not just voluntary movement, but also the release of hormones and neurotransmitters that tell the rest of your body when to grow, when to rest, and when to shift resources elsewhere. When your brain no longer perceives a consistent demand for strength or mobility, it begins to deprioritize muscle support in favor of energy conservation, and this shift occurs through a very specific neurochemical cascade. One of the most powerful drivers of this cascade is the balance between excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmitters, particularly dopamine, acetylcholine, and GBA. When you engage in physical activity, especially resistance-based or coordinated movement, the brain releases dopamine, which not only enhances motivation, but also signals to the hypothalamus that the body requires increased hormonal output for adaptation. This includes the release of testosterone, growth hormone, and IGF-1, all necessary for building and repairing muscle tissue. However, when movement is limited or non-existent for long periods, dopamine transmission slows and the brain starts shifting toward inhibitory neurochemistry. Acetylcholine, which is essential for neuromuscular signaling, becomes downregulated, reducing your ability to fully recruit muscle fibers during contractions. At the same time, GABA increases, promoting a more sedated state that favors stillness, passivity, and even muscle relaxation. In this neurochemical environment, the brain effectively turns down the volume on motor activation, leading to what's known as reduced cortical excitability. Reduced cortical excitability means your brain is no longer firing strong, clear signals to your muscles. The result is diminished motor unit recruitment, decreased muscle tension, and eventually a failure to maintain the muscle mass you already have. But this doesn't just affect movement, it affects hormone production. The hypothalamic pituitary axis HPA, which controls many of the hormones associated with muscle growth, is highly sensitive to neural input. When the brain senses regular physical challenge, it stimulates the pituitary to secrete growth hormone, which triggers muscle protein synthesis. But in a sedentary state, the HPA axis downshifts and the body reduces its anabolic output. This becomes a compounding issue. Less brain activation leads to less hormone production, which leads to less muscle stimulation, which leads to less brain activation, creating a vicious cycle of decline. Additionally, a sedentary lifestyle also alters the function of the prefrontal cortex and the brain's default mode network. These regions become more active when we're idle or not focused on external tasks. While this might seem harmless, prolonged activation of the default mode network has been associated with increased rumination, stress reactivity, and depressive symptoms, all of which are linked to elevated cortisol. Cortisol, as discussed earlier, is profoundly catabolic. It breaks down muscle tissue and disrupts sleep quality, further impairing the body's ability to recover and grow. What's critical to understand here is that none of this is happening in isolation. The brain interprets stillness and passivity as a biological cue to shut off systems that are no longer needed. If you are not engaging in regular movement that challenges your nervous system, your brain assumes that muscle strength and endurance are no longer required for survival, and it gradually reroutes energy and focus away from muscular support and toward fat storage and metabolic conservation. Cortisol is one of the most misunderstood hormones in the human body. Most people hear the word and immediately associate it with stress, and they're not wrong. But what's often overlooked is just how deeply cortisol influences muscle health. strength output and recovery. In healthy amounts and within its natural circadian rhythm, cortisol plays a vital role in waking the body up, managing inflammation, and helping to mobilize energy. However, when cortisol remains elevated beyond its intended windows due to chronic stress, poor sleep, overexertion, or extended inactivity, it becomes one of the most powerful catabolic forces in the body, directly opposing the mechanisms responsible for muscle growth and repair. Cortisol overload doesn't just interfere with your performance in the gym, it silently sabotages your progress at the biochemical level all day long. Under normal circumstances, cortisol levels rise in the early morning to prepare your brain and body for alertness and productivity. They gradually taper off throughout the day, allowing the body to shift into a parasympathetic state by evening so it can rest and recover. This rhythm is highly coordinated with light exposure, movement, and perceived psychological safety. But in modern life, these signals are frequently disrupted. When you combine prolonged sitting, artificial lighting, information overload, and emotional stressors, emails, social media, deadlines, you create a constant low-grade emergency signal in the brain. The hypothalamus, unable to distinguish between emotional and physical threats, activates the hypothalamic pituitary, adrenals HPA axis, and floods the bloodstream with cortisol. What follows is a shift in the body's internal priorities. It begins breaking down non-essential tissue, like muscle, in order to preserve resources and maintain readiness for survival. Cortisol is catabolic because it breaks down complex structures into simpler components for quick energy. In the context of muscle, this means degrading muscle proteins into amino acids to be converted into glucose via gluconeogenesis. This may make sense in the short term during fasting or high alert situations, but when cortisol remains elevated day after day, week after week, it becomes a serious threat to lean muscle mass. High cortisol also suppresses the secretion of testosterone and growth hormone, two of the most important anabolic hormones required for muscle growth. It blunts the activity of mTOR, the key intracellular signal for protein synthesis. It lowers insulin sensitivity, which reduces nutrient uptake into muscle cells, and it interferes with sleep, which is when muscle repair and hormonal rebalancing primarily occur. It's also important to recognize how cortisol affects your motivation and drive to train. High cortisol impairs dopamine transmission, making it harder to feel pleasure or reward from physical activity. It becomes more difficult to initiate effort or sustain intensity. Over time, this leads to lower training volume, weaker muscle contractions, and diminished recovery, all of which signal to the body that strength is no longer a high priority. And this creates a paradox. The very stress that should be motivating action is actually reducing your capacity to respond effectively. One of the most overlooked effects of cortisol overload is its ability to alter body composition independent of calorie intake. Chronically high cortisol shifts fat storage toward the visceral region around your organs, while simultaneously accelerating muscle wasting. This not only weakens physical performance, but increases inflammation, raises your risk of metabolic disorders, and further disrupts the hormonal environment needed to maintain lean muscle. Even when people maintain their diets or training plans, they often see stalled progress or unexpected fat gain because their internal hormonal environment has turned anti-growth. The danger of cortisol is that it doesn't scream, it whispers. It works quietly in the background, undermining the very processes your body needs to build strength, resilience, and performance. It is not just a stress hormone. It is a regulatory signal telling your body what to prioritize. And when it dominates, the message it sends is break down muscle, store fat, conserve energy. Muscle loss doesn't happen all at once. It begins slowly, often imperceptibly, as a result of compounded daily habits that seem benign, but signal to the body that muscular strength is no longer necessary. One of the most underestimated contributors to this process is poor sleep, especially when paired with long, uninterrupted periods of inactivity throughout the day. The result is a silent, progressive condition called sarcopenia, age-related muscle loss. While typically associated with people in their 60s or 70s, the process of sarcopenia often begins decades earlier. particularly in individuals who spend long hours sitting, moving very little, and failing to get adequate, restorative sleep. These behaviors affect not only the physical activation of muscle, but also the neuroendocrine signals required to maintain and regenerate it. Sarcopenia is not just a matter of getting older. It's a predictable biological consequence of behavior-driven signaling loss between your brain, hormones, and muscle tissue. At the center of this process is the interaction between movement and sleep. Physical activity during the day doesn't just build muscle through mechanical load. It actually primes the brain to produce the right neuromodulators and hormones that govern sleep architecture. When you move your body, especially through resistance training, walking, or even isometric holds, you increase adenosine accumulation in the brain. Adenosine is a neuromodulator that builds throughout the day and promotes sleep pressure in the evening. The more consistent the physical engagement, the more pronounced the adenosine signal becomes. But when the day is largely sedentary, adenosine builds too slowly or insufficiently, and sleep onset becomes delayed or fragmented. This means even if you get into bed, the quality and depth of your sleep may be compromised, reducing the amount of slow wave sleep, also known as deep sleep, where the vast majority of muscle repair and hormone release takes place. During deep sleep, your body releases pulses of growth hormone and testosterone, both essential for muscle protein synthesis and recovery. If you're not entering this stage consistently, your body cannot rebuild what was broken down during training or normal daily activity. What's more, poor sleep increases cortisol levels the next day, which further suppresses anabolic hormone production, reduces insulin sensitivity, and promotes catabolism. It becomes a negative feedback loop. You don't move enough during the day, which impairs your ability to sleep deeply at night, which in turn damages your ability to recover, repair, and build muscle, which leaves you with even less energy and motivation to move the next day. Over time, this cycle leads to a progressive loss of muscle fiber size and function. This is the earliest stage of sarcopenia, and it's happening right now in countless individuals who assume that hitting the gym for 30 minutes a few times a week is enough to counteract 8 to 10 hours of sitting and a poor sleep routine. The effects of this cycle are not just physical. Sarcopenia is tightly linked with cognitive decline, metabolic syndrome, increased risk of falls, and reduced lifespan. Muscle is an endocrine organ. It secretes myokines, which are signaling molecules that reduce inflammation and improve brain health. When you lose muscle, you're not just losing strength, you're losing systemic protection. And the two biggest behavioral drivers of this process are sleep disruption and sedentary patterns. Neither requires dramatic life events to begin. They simply require a modern lifestyle filled with screen exposure, inactivity, and inconsistent sleep timing. If you wake up feeling unrefreshed, skip movement throughout the day, and struggle to fall asleep at night, your body is receiving a consistent signal that muscle is not needed, and your physiology begins adjusting accordingly. The brain doesn't respond to your goals, it responds to your patterns. And when those patterns communicate disuse, the muscle degrades. The process of reversing muscle decline does not begin with lifting weights or changing your diet. It begins with changing the inputs that tell your nervous system what to prioritize. Your body responds to consistent behavioral signals. If you want to restore strength, maintain lean muscle, and activate growth pathways, you must first re-establish the brain to muscle connection that modern life has gradually dulled. This is not about doing more. It's about doing the right things consistently, small, specific interventions based on how the nervous system regulates energy, hormone output, and motor activation. The first and most essential adjustment is to interrupt prolonged periods of sitting with intentional movement. Neuroscience research shows that standing up and moving for just 2 to 5 minutes every 30 minutes can dramatically improve circulation, increase neuromuscular signaling, and reduce the molecular markers of muscle atrophy. These micro movements do not need to be strenuous. Even bodyweight squats, calf raises, wall presses, or simply walking around your room while rotating your shoulders can turn on the motor cortex and reestablish communication between the brain and the muscular system. Next is light exposure. The visual system plays a key role in regulating cortisol and sleep-wake cycles, both of which affect anabolic hormone levels. Morning sunlight exposure within 30 to 60 minutes of waking helps align your circadian rhythm, boost morning cortisol when it's needed most, and promote nighttime melatonin release. This indirectly supports muscle recovery by improving sleep quality and balancing stress hormones. Artificial light at night, on the other hand, disrupts this process, reducing screen exposure and switching to dim, warm lighting 90 minutes before bed reinforces the brain's signal that it is time to shift into parasympathetic dominance, which is necessary for recovery and hormonal recalibration. Equally important is the use of compound movement patterns that stimulate multiple joints and muscle groups. These movements, like squats, deadlifts, push-ups, lunges, or pulling exercises, engage a broader range of motor units and signal to the brain that full body strength is required. This level of demand triggers anabolic responses in the form of mTOR activation, IGF-1 release, and increased testosterone production. The nervous system interprets these complex, demanding patterns as a sign of necessity and, in turn, maintains the circuitry needed to support muscular development. Movement becomes the message. We need to grow, not shrink. Even if these movements are performed with body weight or resistance bands, when done with intensity and intention, they are sufficient to stimulate the anabolic pathways you need to rebuild lost strength. Breathwork and posture also influence muscular function in ways often overlooked. When you breathe diaphragmatically, you stimulate the vagus nerve, reduce cortisol, and improve oxygen delivery to working muscles. When your posture is upright, spine aligned, and shoulders relaxed, your nervous system interprets the body as alert and engaged. This improves motor output and cognitive clarity. When your posture collapses, the brain receives feedback that aligns more with fatigue, low arousal, and conservation. Over time, that pattern dulls neural output to large muscle groups, particularly the core, glutes, and upper back. Simply sitting tall with your feet planted and your neck in line with your spine can subtly but powerfully recondition how your brain perceives physical readiness. Finally, consistency over intensity is what restores neural drive. The nervous system is plastic. It adapts to what you repeat. If you repeat stillness, it downregulates strength. If you repeat purposeful movement, it upregulates growth. A brief morning routine of controlled, compound movement, visual stimulation from natural light, and an evening wind down that protects sleep is more impactful for muscle preservation than occasional extreme training. These practices speak the language of your biology. They tell your system, stay strong, stay engaged, stay ready. We often think of muscle as something that's only built in the gym, as if it's a separate entity from the rest of our biology. But the truth is, muscle is not just tissue, it's a language your body uses to communicate health, energy, and survival. Every day through your behaviors, posture, sleep, and movement, or lack of it, you are sending messages to your nervous system about what matters, and your nervous system responds accordingly. If the signal is disuse, your body starts to downregulate. If the signal is engagement, your biology moves toward growth. We've uncovered how a single overlooked habit, chronic passive sitting, is not just a lifestyle choice, but a powerful environmental signal that instructs your brain to switch off strength, deactivate your motor circuits, reduce hormone output, and ultimately dismantle your muscle tissue from the inside out. We've seen how this ties directly to neurotransmitters, sleep cycles, hormonal cascades, and the progressive condition of sarcopenia that begins far earlier than most realize. And more importantly, we've explored how to interrupt that cascade using simple, science-driven protocols, movement breaks, light exposure, postural resets, compound neural activation, and consistent sleep hygiene, not through extremes, but through alignment with your biology. What matters most now is not what you've done in the past, but what you do next. The fix isn't complicated, but it requires awareness, intention, and repetition. Your brain is always listening. It listens to stillness, and it listens to strength. It listens to inactivity and it listens to effort. You get to decide what it hears. So start today, not tomorrow, not next week. Reclaim control of the signals you're sending. Stand, move, breathe a line, reset, and do it often. Because your body is not waiting to be told what you want. It's already responding to what you're doing. Fix this habit before it rewires your body for decline. This is your moment to choose adaptation over degeneration. The science is clear. The tools are simple. The responsibility is yours.